Now, what everybody should be seeing now on your screen is the first slide of our presentation, which says the Colorado Springs Civic Players when Broadway met our town for the Pikes Peak Library District History Symposium, June 2023, and our names.
And you can reduce that up there if you want.
Yeah. Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So everyone, can you hear me?
We can hear you and see the presentation.
Great. Okay. So first we want to share, Rick and I want to share why we thought of doing the Civic Players as a topic several years ago when we were doing a different symposium with the library district. And he and I each had a famous author as our topic that year. Mine was Marshall Sprague, who probably some of you know as writing Newport in the Rockies and sort of being seen as the local historian of Colorado Springs. Frankly, I was a little skeptical of him because he wasn't a scholarly historian. And Rick, yours was?
And mine was Robert Heinlein. He and his wife, Virginia or Ginny, lived here from the late 1940s through the mid 1960s before they moved to California. And he wrote some of his most famous science fiction novels here in Colorado Springs with a more than substantial spattering of references to places around Colorado Springs and along the Front Range.
Both very interesting gentlemen.
Okay, so next. And so one of the things that fascinated me when we decided to do the Civic Players was I had remembered from my work on Robert Heinlein that his wife, Ginny, had been going to classes at Colorado College during the mid-1950s, and in the process became acquainted with some of the Civic Players and became a sort of stagehand. She was described as the wardrobe mistress in a couple of plays, one of which was in the 54-55 season, The Crucible, Arthur Miller's The Crucible. And you see that a scene from that on the right-hand side here, and you see it in the advertising of the Civic Players for that era. Okay, so
Let me go to.
so what happened was that Jenny, as a wardrobe mistress, invited a bunch of the players, both actors and some of the stage hands, to an event at her house. And Robert, it was at the end of the day, and Robert had finished his work for the day in his writing, and he engaged in some conversation with those folks about what it was like to be an actor and participate. Did you want to say something, Kathy?
I was going to explain Marshall Sprague with the players, but that's okay.
Okay, so let me finish then, and then Kathy can talk about Sprague. So they had this event in February of 1955 at their house. Well, Robert finished the book that he was working on in March and sent it off to the publisher. And it was the book Double Star. Next slide. And Double Star was featuring, believe it or not, a somewhat destitute actor who was in need of money and hired on to sort of play a politician in a space-related event. And that led to interplanetary conflict. And I highly recommend reading the novel, so I'm not going to give the rest of the story away. But that's how I got involved in this project with the Civic Players.
Well, and to go back to Marshall Sprague, when we were doing this, we realized that both of these men were acting in the Civic Players. And although they're authors, we didn't particularly think of them as having a lot in common in their perspectives. But we thought, isn't it interesting that these two very famous authors were both enjoying acting in this group, in this local theater group? So we kept that in the backs of our minds. What we found, of course, was a lot of great records, but not necessarily as many as you'd like, and not necessarily what you would expect. So we want to make sure we acknowledge where the sources are. And if any of you are interested in this subject, you can go there, but we're still working on it in the hopes, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, of the usual publication that comes out of this symposium, but might not. We don't know yet. Colorado College Library Special Collections was certainly a place we spent time. Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum Starsmore Center down in the basement, the archives there. Pikes Peak Library District Special Collections, and we need to thank all of the archivists in each of those locations. One of the things that was at first, at least to me, a little disappointing but fun was that the most common sources on the Civic players in Colorado Springs are the playbills. So every time that you look up a collection of something about Civic players and you go to that box in the archive, you find a batch of wonderful, fascinating playbills that are duplicated in the next archive and the next archive and the next archive. Sometimes good clippings. You'd also see that there are scrapbooks put together by the director, but unfortunately, the most things he posted in his scrapbooks were also the playbills. So they're wonderful playbills, but you don't get a lot of else. And so in addition, we started into the additional sources, but we need more. We need more, have to do them ourselves, interviews and private conversations. We need more newspaper research. And my secret weapon in all this is Eve Tilley, the daughter of Lou Tilley, who was with the players, because she remembers everything.
And Lou Tilley did a lot of the set work. We can mention that later as well.
So this is the earliest history. We just want to summarize it real quick. So it was called a drama club at first, and it was part of a national movement to found those. Want to make sure we mention that we see those as really progressive civic causes for people in different cities, and Colorado Springs certainly treated it that way. So you can see it had a first meeting in 1916 as part of the Drama League. Then it withdraws about a decade and a couple years after because it's become strong enough to be its own separate entity. Then it changes its name, and after a couple of decades, to Civic Players, and then there's the Civic Theater. And at first we were confused by all of this, but it's all the same group of people, basically. It disbanded, but not until the 1980s, so it had a good life. Also found through the wonderful material saved that they go back all the way to 1916. When the organization was part of celebrating internationally the anniversary of Shakespeare, and also put on a show that meant a lot to me. In 1925, their show was about a Quaker martyr in Boston, Mary Dyer, who I teach about every semester. And they did a wonderful play, I'm sure, on that.
And then we'll show you as we go here where they did most of their theater performances. The first place that they performed in the World War I time frame, 1916-18, was the Cogswell Theater, which was in Bemis Hall at the Colorado College campus. Okay, next.
And can I ask whoever's got a microphone on to please mute it? Please mute. Thank you.
And then in 1919, the drama club performances moved to the Broadmoor Art Academy. That address might be familiar to some of you, 30 West Dale Street. It's where the Fine Arts Center is now. It was the Penrose House. And when the Penroses built their new house up behind the Broadmoor Hotel, then Julie Penrose turned this property over to the Broadmoor Art Academy, and that's where the drama club did their performances during that early period.
With the drama club, again, I wanted to emphasize that these are people who are extremely civic minded. And when I was looking at some of this early literature, I found two men just as examples of how civic minded they were. These might be familiar names. Gilbert McClurg, whose wife Virginia might be more famous for this than he, but together they formed the Colorado Cliff Dwellers Association and were behind helping to save Mesa Verde National Park. Robert Orms is a very familiar name to anybody in the Pikes Peak Library District because of his collection, but he was the librarian and English faculty for Colorado College and Fountain Valley School, and even in the Army for Camp Hale, and is the author of the first full history of Colorado Springs, the Book of Colorado Springs. From the drama club to the Civic Theater, we're down to the second one. We have these slides repeating and then bold facing where we reach at the moment. So in 27 is when they withdrew from the drama club.
And about that time in the late 1920s, a place that some of you are probably quite familiar with, the new City Auditorium, which we're now trying to save, was opened, just finished, as you can see in that picture. And the drama club gave their performances for a period of time in the little theater in the new City Auditorium. And then after 1935, they moved and did their productions again at 30 West Dale Street in the brand new Fine Arts Center.
One of the points about being civic minded and progress minded, being progressive, includes that they would try to reach backward for plays that put forward what was so great about earlier American life, like Thornton Wilder's Our Town. But they're also members of the progressive era trying to tell people what values they value. So progressive ideas get shared through entertainment. And also we can see a lot at this point. Remember, this is a period where women are achieving suffrage. And so women's roles are getting elevated literally out in society during this period. And you can see their roles being lifted the same way in the plays.
And we moved to 1946. The drama club changed its name to the Civic Players. And I might mention that from about late 1942 through 1945, the drama club had no performances because of World War II. So all that was held in hiatus pending the end of the war.
And then they got master director, Orvis Grout. And I always love Marshall Sprague's biography of Orvis Grout is called The Years of Grout, which sounds like you're trying to clean something out of a dirty drain, but he was an amazing man. You want to say a few words about Orvis?
Well, Orvis Grout went to school and got his bachelor's degree and then a Master of Science degree from Fort Hays, Kansas State College. He got the master's in June of 1937. What he was focusing on was little theater performances and their history in Western Kansas. And then you can see in this slide how things evolved, and he became the drama club director. And when he became the drama club director, he brought all kinds of Broadway plays, 4 or 5 a year in each season to Colorado Springs. He doubled and then tripled the performance for these plays, and that brought in a lot of money, which helped fund and sustain their existence.
And this is a quote from Marshall Sprague, that Grout brought something as invaluable as the work of General Palmer or Spencer Penrose to Colorado Springs.
And he retired from the Civic Theater as director in 1979.
And there he is again. This is from the earlier years. He always seems to have a pipe in his hand.
And this is the first page of his 1937 thesis. You can find that online. And so there were a lot of activities that primarily Orvis Grout tended to sponsor beyond the Broadway plays. You see some of them here. Go ahead, Kathy.
All right. He'd do theater arts classes and workshops,
Yeah.
radio, Imperial Players up in the mountains. And the Easter pageant at Garden of the Gods, which is so famous and hopefully will return.
Next. So here you see the class in the theater arts. That was a subscription class by the Fine Arts Center that Grout taught. You had to pay money for that one. But the workshop offers on the right-hand side was teaching stage technique and acting and by Grout. And that was free to anyone who wanted to come and join in. Next. And then the Civic Players had contests to write radio scripts, either as poetry or prose. And then they would give radio broadcast performances, and they gave well over 100. The pictures on the right are the practices for their 101st performance. Next. And then they became involved with the Imperial Players up in the Gold Country, and that's where Grout was the director during some of the summer performances, and Lou Tilley did the set production for some of those in the Imperial Theater up there. They also formed a children's theater, and there you see their first performance, and that was in 1953 in September, and it was The Adventures of Tom Sawyer.
And this is the Easter in the Rockies with Mrs. Thayer Tutt. One of the things that I'll bring up again in another slide toward the end that started to bother my husband, I'm pleased to say, was that all these women were known as Mrs. Husband's name, Mrs. Husband's name.
They had no first names of their own.
But that's a pretty fancy one to have. But you can see how big the Easter pageant was.
And then the Civic Players became the Civic Theater in 1959, and some of the performances by that time were pretty tremendous. The military support came in after World War II, and particularly in the 1950s through the 1970s with Fort Carson and Air Force Base and the Air Force Academy after 1958. They acted in some of the plays. A lot of them volunteered as stage crew, and there were annual memberships and ticket sales that were promoted by all of those institutions, and particularly by the Officers' Wives Club at Ent. Next. And so one of the early, in 1957-59, one of the early performers in the Civic Players Civic Theater was a guy named Sidney Pollock. He'd been drafted, and he was at Fort Carson in 57 to 59. He also was a waiter at Giuseppe's Depot. But he came back, and when they were in financial trouble in the late 70s, he began to help support the Fine Arts Center and to sustain the theater group because he had become an Oscar-winning producer and director. And you'll see the one that he got the Oscar for, his film Out of Africa.
He seemed to be directing almost anything that Robert Redford did in those days.
Yeah, Jeremiah Johnson, for example. Then in the papers, the Academy's and Ent papers, the Mountaineer, the Skyline Observer, you see on the right, those papers were promoting any of the people there that were stationed there who wanted to do dramatic readings and try to get a role in one of the plays. And that's in 61. And then the Falcon News, which was the Academy paper after they moved here from Denver, you see there's an Academy colonel who's starring in the show at the Fine Arts Center, Send Me No Flowers. Next. And then you see here in the left-hand clipping here, how they're promoting ticket sales and people in uniform. And you have the women of the Officers' Wives Club doing the same thing and trying to gain a lot of support, sort of like the military institutions do now with the Pikes Peak Rodeo, believe it or not.
Yes, actually, that is comparable.
And then one of the big performances in 63, No Time for Sergeants. That was really an important one because that related to the military.
And that's starred as a film starred Andy Griffith and made him a star. My dad loved that story, having just been a sergeant in World War II. You can see more theater tickets going to military, more involvement.
And Captain Thomas Smith, as the clipping says on the left, was a member of the board of directors of the Civic Players at that point.
And they were always a family affair. So Sharon Sprague, for example, is the daughter of Marshall Sprague. And there are many, many family members participating with each other in the Civic Players. One of whom is what I said is my secret weapon, Eve Tilley. And her dad had so many functions of setting up behind the scenes, really, that she lived through the Civic Players. And she also, as I mentioned here, has the not so unique or secret compliment that the Heinleins toyed with whether they could adopt her away from her parents. That Rick and I already knew a story of this happening to another prominent family in Colorado Springs with a lovely daughter who they tried to adopt away from her parents. And apparently they did this with at least 2 lovely daughters. Of course, Eve ended up being the Pikes Peak Arts Council leader, and she knows an awful lot and has been very generous in helping our project. There are also a lot of colorful characters just associated with Civic Players, not surprisingly. And one of my favorites is Lillian Bueno McHugh, who was a mystery writer and sort of seems like one of those colorful characters in maybe an Agatha Christie mystery. But you can see she was very well educated. She also performed with the chorale, a lot of civic leadership in the arts, and was the president of the Mystery Writers of America. Wanted to make that point again and again, that the Civic Players delivered inspirational, redeeming messages for the pre and post World War II era. Like if you're staging Caine Mutiny or the Andersonville trial, which is the one on the left, you are presenting some real ethical dilemmas that occurred militarily. And they had so many plays to choose from Broadway and present the right and wrong of things that would be educational to everyone. And ultimately, and this is partly a nod to my colleague, Chris Nickel, who's here this evening to present as well, someone that she lauded very well in one of the Pikes Peak Library District Symposium books, The Suffragist, Lillian Kerr. And Lillian was many things. She was the founder of the Women's Club of Colorado Springs and co-founder of the Civic League of Colorado Springs. But she also, of course, being civic-minded and being dedicated to anything civic, was in the Civic Players too.
Well, she was one of the original drama club people in 1915.
Yes, all the way back. And so here's this woman who's really leading the effort in Colorado to promote the National Woman's Party. The Equal Rights Amendment is spelled out really well by Chris Nickel in that book that you can still get from the Library District. And here, to go with Rick's concern, one of the things that Lillian fought was the use of Mrs. as though it was a woman's first name, and then her husband as the last name. But she also got teased by another Civic Players family member, Glad Morath, because the whole Max Morath family is part of the Civic Players, very musically inclined, teased her that when she performed on stage with the Civic Players, Lillian used histrionics. Lillian probably overacted, or at least Glad thought so. So one of the things that's just wonderful about this story is that you learn that civic theater was used as basically a social reform movement in companionship with progressivism, and even all the way up through the ERA, to deliver important messages to communities, and to also just give a wonderful outlet and training and enjoyment to remarkable people who lived here in Colorado Springs and probably many other cities. Thank you for sharing it with us today.